How you all doing? It's nice to be back, and it's a glorious day here in Tartu. And yes, I'm Dylan Beattie, and this is the story of typography. And you know that because I have this title slide over here that tells you what I'm talking about and who I am, and that's my email. And it doesn't look like this is saying very much, but what if my title slide looked like that? Now, if this was a newspaper or like a printed report, you wouldn't notice it. But on a PowerPoint slide, you're like, oh, Times New Roman, that's a bit interesting. What if it looked like that? Now you're thinking maybe it's like a medieval thing, like knights in armor and King Henry. What if it looked like that? Kind of aggressive army stamps. You're thinking, oh, it's a talk that he wants people to think about the military. What if it looked like that? The Finnish death metal title slide. I mean, you don't know what it says, but it's clearly very rock and roll, right? What if I came up here and I said, hello, I'm Dylan Beattie, and this is the story of typography. And you went, really? Comic Sans in the opening talk? That's brave. Comic Sans is like JavaScript. There's nothing wrong with it. People just use it for all the wrong things. But after all of those, we come back to this original slide, and compared to some of those choices, it doesn't really say very much. Because this is set in a font called Frutiger. And Frutiger was created by this guy, Adrian Frutiger. And this font was created for a project in the 1970s to replace all of the signs at Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. And there's a lovely quote from Adrian Frutiger. He says, if you remember the shape of a spoon with which you just ate some soup, then the spoon had a poor shape. He thought that typography should just blend into the background, that you should read the words, but you shouldn't notice the letters. And this was kind of his principle. And we're going to explore some of those ideas today. Because whenever we when we format an email, we write a report, we make a web page, we choose a font to use in our mobile app, whether we know it or not, we are sending a message to people about the kind of person, the kind of company that we think we are, and the way that we want the world to see us. So we are going to tell the story of typography, and we're going to start here. It's 5,000 years ago in ancient Babylon. There's these two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And this is kind of a big deal for humankind, because this is the point in history where human beings started to grow crops. There was this incredibly fertile land there, so they could grow crops, they could harvest them. They weren't wandering around, so they actually started making buildings and settlements and cities. And we had, for the first time in history, human beings had too much food. We'd never, ever had too much food before, but people were harvesting more than they could eat. And so the priests came up with an idea. They went, oh, extra food, well, why don't you give it to us, and we'll look after it for you in our temple. And then if we get to the winter and the food runs out, you can come and you can get your extra food back. And we'll keep a little percentage because we're priests, of course. And they needed to develop a system to keep track of who had deposited how much of their harvest in the temples. And so they started making marks in clay tablets like this one. Now, at this point in history, human beings, we've been using spoken language for tens of thousands of years. And as soon as we started creating and making marks in clay tablets, we discovered that there were a lot of things humans already did that were quite hard to represent on a piece of clay. Now, we're going to do a little quiz now. What we're going to do is I'm going to show you something on the slide. And I'm going to count 3, 2, 1, and then you all shout out the answer. And I'm going to make it easy. All the answers, they are the names of countries. So I'm going to count 3, 2, 1. We shout out the answer. You ready? We'll start it with a nice, easy one. Okay, so this one. You ready? 3, 2, 1. Australia. Very good. Correct answer. A little bit more difficult, maybe. 3, 2, 1. Sweden. Sweden. Excellent. All right. How about this one? 3, 2, 1. France. That one. 3, 2, 1. Norway. This one. 3, 2, 1. Brilliant. Full marks so far. Let's increase the difficulty. 3, 2, 1. Thailand. Thai. Land, right? About this one. 3, 2, 1. Romania. No? One more. 3, 2, 1. Canada. In Japanese. Now, these are all different ways of taking an idea and conveying it visually. These are pictograms. Even if you'd never spoken to another human being, when aliens arrive from outer space and they're looking down at planet Earth, if they have an outline drawing of Australia, they'll be like, oh yeah, that one. We're going to land on that one there. That's the one on the map. And the Eiffel Tower, you recognize. It's this famous pictorial emblem. So if you want to communicate the idea of France to somebody where you have no common language, you can draw a picture of the Eiffel Tower, and if they've ever seen it, they'll be like, yeah, I recognize that. That's the thing from there. Now, the revolution in modern pictographic communication actually happened in 1964 when Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games. Now, they had this challenge. They had people visiting Japan from all over the world who could not read, write, or speak Japanese. They could not even decipher the alphabet that Japanese is written in. Well, actually, one of the 3 alphabets that Japanese is written in. So the Olympic Games organizers came up with a set of signs that were pictorial. This is where a lot of these ideas come from. If you're hungry, you look for the knife and fork. If you're thirsty, you look for the teacup. If you want to, go and take a shower after your Olympic event, there's signs for the showers on there. Now, these ideas you recognize. You look for the thing that looks like what you want, and you're like, okay, there we go. Now, something else is happening. Back in the 3rd millennia BC, this idea of writing, people are making little marks in clay tablets, but they're doing a lot of this, and they're getting in a hurry, and so they get a little bit sloppy, and they stop drawing the whole cow. They come up with like the horns and the ears, and also, for some weird reason, everything gets rotated 90 degrees. We think this is because when you're writing in wet clay, you're constantly turning it so you're not smudging it with your hand. But stuff's getting translated, and this is a massive time for trade across the Mediterranean. We've got ships going from Greece to North Africa, over to what is now Israel, plying all of these trades. And so there are people there who just are getting these clay tablets, and they're seeing this sign, and they no longer know that that is a drawing of a cow. They just look at that, they're like, oh yeah, that symbol means cow. I don't know why. And maybe someone's like, yeah, turn it sideways. They're like, oh yeah, horns. But most people like cow, 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 they just recognize it. There is a symbol that all of us use today, which is not a picture of anything that has ever existed. And it's this. It's chat, it's speech bubbles. Because these don't exist. When I talk to you now, I don't get a circle above my head with words in it. But this is such a universal convention from comic books we read as kids. You get to do like a meeting with somebody, and you're in one of those video chat systems, and they're like, oh, can you open the chat? You look for this thing on your screen, so you can click it and be like, yeah, there we go. We're having a chat now. Now, something that I love, there is a symbol which, when I was first getting started in computers, was pictographic. And now, it's ideographic because a lot of people have never seen a real one. And it's this. Because when Microsoft Windows was launched in the 90s, they're like, we're going to put a picture of the disk. So when you get your disk out of your drawer to save your work, you go, oh yeah, click that button. It was designed to make it easy to use. Now, there's kids out there who've never seen a floppy disk. To them, that's just the save button. They have no idea what it represents, but they understand that that button means save. Now, establishing this idea, what does this symbol mean? Anyone work on like a Slack or a Teams workspace where people reply with emoji, and you ask a question like, it looks like the media CDN's gone down, there's no images, anyone know what's up with it? And someone replies, eyes. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean, I am looking into this for you now? Or does it mean, I'm watching this because I also want to know when there's an answer? Because what you do next could be radically different on those 2 interpretations, but we don't really have a convention yet. Slack have tried very hard to let others know you're looking into this, but they didn't tell people that's what they did. So I'm in some teams where that means I'm looking into this, and I'm in other teams where it means, yeah, I'm watching this. I want to see what happens. And I'm in a couple of WhatsApp conversations where if someone sends you eyes, it means, it's rolling eyes. It's like, what have you done now? Now, there is a universally recognizable ideogram, which is this one, which also comes from the Olympic Games 1964. And the first time people saw it, they probably, for obvious reasons, they didn't want to put a picture of what happens in the toilet, because that would be gross. But they came up with this idea of, well, there's the men's and the ladies and everything. By the way, check out the bathroom signs in this venue, because they're really quite you kind of have to know what you're looking at once you've seen them. Check those out during the break. But all these signs, they don't mean anything until we've learned. We've learned that means Norway. We've learned that means Spain. We've learned that means the Olympic Games. These are ideograms. But you still need to understand the thing that you're looking at. Someone needs to have told you about it earlier. Human language then comes up with another revolution. What happens is we take the ears off the cow completely. It spins another 90 degrees. Now, the ancient Hebrew word for a cow is aleph. And by the time Aleph made it across the Mediterranean to Greece, the Greeks were like Aleph, Aleph, Alpha. It became Alpha. There's another Hebrew word, Beth. Beth means a house. And Bethlehem in the Bible stories literally means the house of bread. And it started out as a picture of a house. And then they kind of stopped drawing the door, and then it got rotated and spun around 90 degrees and made it across to Greece, and Beth became Beta, and Alpha Beta became alphabet. And we had invented phonographic writing, where the symbols stand for sounds. So they are a way of visualizing spoken language. Thailand, if you know that's Thai and that's land, Thailand, you're like, yes, I know that word because I've heard that word before. Romania, same thing. This is phonographic writing. Now, this is awesome. Like, we've invented a whole bunch of cool stuff. We are now there's now a weird period happens in history. We're going to jump forward about 3,000 years. Now, I find it astonishing that for about a millennium, we had paper and we had books, and we didn't have any paper books. Because paper was invented in China, ancient China, during the Han Dynasty around the year 100 AD, and it was used to make scrolls, because nobody in China had thought to make like a book, or a codex is technically what it's called. And in Europe, we'd invented the codex, which is pages with covers on them, but we didn't have paper, so we made them out of vellum. We made them literally out of very thin sheets of animal skin. And it took about 1,000 years before these two ideas got kind of mashed up and combined. Now, industrial printing was actually invented by this guy. If you wanted, in the days before industrial typesetting, if you wanted a Bible, what you do is you find a Bible, and then you find someone to copy it for you, which was probably a monastery. And they would sit and they would copy the Bible by hand, or the Quran, or your prayer book. Books were rare. Most people couldn't read. Most people couldn't write. Making one single book would take years. What revolutionized that was the invention of the movable type printing press. Now, we are taught in Europe that printing was invented by one man in Germany in about 1650, I believe. This guy, Johannes Gutenberg, the inventor of movable type. Now, this is celebrated as like a massive achievement of European industrial engineering. And to understand why movable type was such a big idea, we're going to say, well, what is type, and why was moving it important? Because the word type, like, we're developers. If type of type equals type, then you type your program, and if you type it like very gently, that's called a weakly typed language, and if you press the keys very hard, that's a strongly typed language. But the word type actually means to strike. It comes from ancient Greek. And the innovation that revolutionized printing was this thing. It's a printing block, a piece of type, one individual letter, and you could take a bunch of these and you could arrange them in a matrix and use that to make pages. Now, this was actually invented, again in China, around the year 1040 AD, by this guy, Bai Sheng. Most people have forgotten him, but there's a crater on the moon named after this guy. So, if you look at a map of the moon, the Bai Sheng crater is named after the inventor of movable type. But he did it using ceramic and ash and wax, and it wasn't particularly durable. It was Gutenberg who's credited with the invention of modern printing. Now, like I said, Gutenberg, he kind of didn't invent the whole thing. He was a little bit like Steve Jobs and the iPhone. He got a lot of credit for seeing that there was a whole bunch of technology around that was good enough that if you put it together, you would have this amazing new kind of device. And the thing that really revolutionized it was this thing. It's called a punch. And you could use the punch to make the thing on the right there with the hole in it. That's called a stereotype. And then you could use the stereotype to make these things. These are little lead printing blocks. And because you were using one punch to make, say, 20 stereotypes, and then each stereotype could make a couple of hundred pieces of type, you could do this at speed. You could mass produce printed books. Gutenberg is celebrated for a thing called the Gutenberg Bible, which was, he printed fewer than 200 of these. Took 5 years. So 5 years to print 200 Bibles. Now, this was pretty revolutionary compared to what we'd had before, and it took off. And people were like, this is amazing. They started printing books. The process got industrialized. It spread throughout Europe. It literally revolutionized the way that human beings capture and communicate and share knowledge. Books became cheaper, which meant more people learned to read, which meant there was a bigger market, which meant there was more investment, which meant the costs came down. We fast forward from the 1450s to the 1950s, and we've gone from 5 years to make 200 Bibles to 50 million printed newspapers every day just in the mainland United States. And the astonishing thing is it was done using exactly the same principle of movable type. But we had engineered movable type into what is probably the coolest machine I have ever seen in my life. It's a thing called a linotype. Now, if you ever get a chance to see one of these, they have them in some museums all over the place. The linotype machine is invented by a guy called Ottmar Mergenthaler in 1886. And this thing is astonishing. It's built with the precision of a wristwatch, but it's about the size of a church organ. It's this enormous machine. I got a couple of photos of one that I took at Amberley in the south of England a few months back. Now, the key to the linotype machine is this thing. This is a linotype matrix. It's basically that stereotype that you can use with molten lead to make print. But the way that these things actually work, this is a wonderful visualization that somebody sent me, which this lady, Sylvia Itzigel, created this for Hamburg Museum. So this is how the linotype machine actually works. It has a keyboard. And so you sit down, you want to do some linotyping. You crank up the power, you crank up the gas, you adjust your chair so it's just right. And then you start typing. And every time you press one of these keys on the keyboard, what happens is these linotype matrices, they drop down these channels and they get lined up on this little thing here, which is has a name which I've completely forgotten. Then this thing gets shunted up, moved sideways. Now, hanging off the side of your linotype machine, there is a crucible of molten lead. Because, hey, do you have one of those on your computer? No, but you should, because it's cool. And this thing literally pumps molten lead into the mouthpiece here, and that then spits out this slug of cast lead with the letter types engraved in it. Good linotypers could do about 70 words per minute on this thing, but what made it so efficient is as soon as you've finished and you've cast your slug of lead, all of these little letters, these matrices, they get shunted back up to the top of the machine, and each of those matrices has a set of teeth on it, which are engraved in a 7-bit binary coding pattern, which means it can automatically drop them straight back into the correct channels. So you can just go round and round and round, 70 words per minute. This is how they printed 50 million newspapers a day. They take that hot metal, they use that to make the master printing plate, they flip that around, they take a cast off that, that goes onto a drum, and then the drum is the thing that you see in the movies with the doom, 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 stop the presses. That's exactly how they made it. By the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, there were about 10,000, maybe 100,000 of these linotype machines in use. Yeah, 100,000 all over the world. These things were everywhere. They had warehouses full of them in every printing, museum, newspaper press plant in the world. By 2007, they were basically gone. There were none of them anymore. They existed only in museums. Now, Linotype, the company, still exists because nobody wanted their machines. Nobody wanted their hot metal type and their spare parts and their valves and their gas furnaces and all this stuff anymore. But they also owned something which stayed as relevant as it has ever been right through into the digital age: fonts. Linotype owns Helvetica. If you want to use Helvetica, one of the most famous fonts in the world, on your record cover or your posters or your conference branding, technically you are supposed to go to Linotype and purchase a license for it. That's why everyone uses Arial, because Arial comes free with Windows, so you don't have to pay for it. But Linotype, this ownership of these fonts, this was a big deal. And when we talk about fonts and typefaces, what we're actually talking about, let's say we're going to design a font. So we're going to start off with the capital letter T. We're going to start with a vertical stroke here, but we got to start making decisions. What is our font going to look like? Square corners, rounded corners. How tall is it going to be? How wide is it going to be? Do we want it like flourishy, like it was written with a paintbrush? Or do we want it to be kind of geometric and solid and vertical? We're going to put a thing across the top. This comes from the ancient Phoenician practice of using a cross for a tally mark. How tall is it going to be? How wide is it going to be? How fat is it going to be? How heavy? How light? All of these are decisions that affect the experience of the people who are going to look at what we put out there and read that based on it. Are we going to give it serifs? Are we going to give it pointy corners? Are we going to combine the two and give it pointy corners with little chamfered edges? Or are we just going to stick with something lightweight and minimalist? We take a letter Y. What does that look like? Is it going to have a curved descender? Is it going to have a round descender? Is it going to look like an angle or a bucket? The letter O, is it a circle? Is it a square? Is it an oval? Is it going to be vertical? Are we going to maybe narrow this a little bit? Are we going to put it on a slant? We have all of these decisions that go into how we design a piece of type. What about our descenders? Are they going to be flourished? Are they going to be easy? Even the letter E. Letter E, how high is the descender going to be? How high is the crosspiece going to be? Is it going to be at an angle? Is it going to be geometric? Will it look like it was made on machine? Is it going to look like it was drawn with a marker pen? Now, fonts used to be designed by hand. This is Edward Johnson. The typeface is called Johnson. This is one of the most famous typefaces in the world because it was designed for the London Underground, and it's still used. If you ever ride the tube or any of the train systems in London, this is the font they use on all of their things. And each one of these fonts would be designed with a pencil, and then those punches and those metal matrices would be created by hand using files and a precision you could only achieve working in metal. But while all this is going on, a revolution is coming. It's the peak of linotype's heyday, the 1970s, and around the world, hackers and computer enthusiasts are kind of looking at this and going, hey, we've got an idea. Now, at this point, computers aren't that new. The earliest computers, the PDP-1 was the first computer that actually had a typewriter keyboard. It could handle text input. It took about another 20 years, though, before we seriously started looking at typography as something you could do with a computer. Now, we got a shout out here to a guy called Don Lancaster, who, radio electronics for men with ideas in electronics. It was the 1970s. It was a very different time. And in 1973, this magazine ran an article called How to Build a TV Typewriter, which was a machine that you could press keys and it would put letters on your television. That was it. Like, you couldn't edit them. It wasn't a word processor. It didn't have any memory. You couldn't print it out. You could literally do nothing with it except put letters on your television screen. So it was kind of useless, but it laid the foundation for a lot of really interesting ideas that were coming. Now, ASCII is pretty much standard by this point. It's been a standard for over a decade. Everyone's using it except IBM, who are off doing their own thing. And so what we're going to look at now, when you press A on your computer, your 8-bit Commodore 64 or whatever it is you've got, what's actually happening there is the A is ASCII code 65. So you push your key, and it takes that number 65, and it looks it up in something called a character generator, which is basically this huge dictionary that maps ASCII codes onto big, complicated numbers. Anyone know what that number is in binary? Really? Nobody? All right, I prepared it. It looks like that. And the point about that is that if we take that binary number and we chop it and we arrange it as a grid, what we get is a bitmap. We get the shape of that letter A, which we can then push into that chunk of memory on our display controller, and we get the letter A coming out on the screen. Now, bitmapped fonts on screen, they were fantastic. At the same time, people are starting to think about digital typesetting for creating books. There is a thing called TeX, which turned into LaTeX. Anyone ever worked with LaTeX? Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, very horrible in all kinds of ways. LaTeX became the de facto standard for writing scientific papers because it could produce very, very high quality typeset output, but you couldn't see it. When you worked on a LaTeX document, you edit code that looks like this, and then you send it to a printer, and you get back the thing on the left, and you're like, oh, all right, probably nobody will notice that mistake. Let's just print it anyway. Now, when you look through the history of technology, there are two things that really stand out. One of them is the number of things that were groundbreaking, like revolutionary when they happened, and now you're just like, yeah, big deal. The other one is how many of those things came out of one single company.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of any contradictory reports. Our unification of laws is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
Now that commercial was broadcast in the middle halftime break of the Super Bowl, the most expensive advertising slot in the history of television. It was directed by Ridley Scott, who has won Oscars and did Aliens and Thelma and Louise and Gladiator and The Martian, all these other kinds of movies. Apple were not doing things the way anybody else does things. And the Macintosh was genuinely revolutionary when it comes to type and typesetting. It came with a graphical display, which meant it included fonts. Now, Apple didn't want to go to Linotype and people and buy fonts from them. So they hired this lady, Susan Kare, and she created all of the typefaces that shipped with the original Apple Macintosh. Some of them were kind of copies of other established typefaces, like it had a typeface called New York that looked like Times New Roman, and there was a Geneva one which was like Helvetica. Some of them were completely original. One of the iconic ones was called Chicago, and then Chicago cropped up again 20 years later, because if you had a first-generation iPod, Chicago was the hardware font that was used on those players. But the most powerful computer that Apple launched in 1984 wasn't a computer. It was the thing next to the computer. It was the Apple LaserWriter. The LaserWriter had 12, so the Mac had an 8 megahertz processor, the LaserWriter had 12 megahertz. It had a 512K of RAM, it had a megabyte frame buffer. This is unheard of for 1984, and they put this stuff in a printer, and the reason they did it is that the third piece of the puzzle was this thing, PageMaker. PageMaker would allow you to create layouts on your screen and then send them to your LaserWriter printer. And so for the first time, you had literally desktop publishing. You could take a concept, turn it into a printed page, print it, see what it looked like, and then send your files to a bureau who would make 10,000 copies of your magazine or whatever it is that you were working on. Now, why was this such a big deal? Well, these bitmap fonts that shipped with the Mac, they looked fantastic on screen, but when you scale them up, they get really kind of blocky. Every font on the Mac shipped us two versions. There was a screen version, and there was a PostScript version. PostScript was the page description language they created to make this thing work. And PostScript describes shapes in terms of mathematics. So say we want to draw a circle. Now, we are working in inches here, because even the enlightened parts of the world that work in the metric system still use dots per inch when it comes to typesetting, because of the influence of linotype machines and all that kind of stuff. So we want to draw a circle here, and our circle is 4 inches wide, 4 inches high, or that's 4 inches as a center, and it's, say, ½ inch radius. So what we got to do is, for every dot that we might be able to draw, we got to figure out, is that dot inside this circle or not? Yes or no? So for each point P, we're going to take P.x minus 4, P.y minus 4, square that. Is that less than 0.5 squared? If it is, it's inside the circle, we paint it. If it's not, we don't paint it. So that gives us the circle there. Now, at 144 dots per inch, this is 20,736 dots to draw a circle 1 inch across on a page. So you think how many circles there are. Now, when you think about creating type, we have, say, a letter O. We got a circle, and then we got an ellipse, and so we need to calculate all the points that are inside that one but aren't inside that one, the intersection of those two things. We have more complicated shapes. We have, say, a lowercase b here. Okay, so we've got our little serifs on it, and now we need to say anything that's inside that or that or that or that or that, but is not inside any of the red circles here. We're talking tens, hundreds, millions of calculations just to draw one letter on a page, and that's why the LaserWriter was the most powerful computer Apple sold. Now, PostScript, computers are getting faster. Chips are getting cheaper, screens are getting better. By the end of the 1980s, this whole idea of having PostScript fonts in your printer and screen fonts on your display, there is obviously a convergence coming. Now, PostScript was created by Adobe, and it cost money. It used a font system called Type 1, and if you wanted to use Type 1 fonts in any of your devices, you had to pay Adobe. It was like $100 or something. Now, if you were selling a printer for $8,000, yeah, no problem, pay them the license fee. When you start selling desktop computers and you're trying to get that price down to the $1,000 mark, you don't want 10% of your computer going to Adobe so you can use their fonts. So Apple turns around to Microsoft, which does not happen very often in the history of technology, and goes, hey, you want to screw Adobe? And Microsoft goes, yeah. And so they come up with a completely new way of embedding fonts, TrueType. Now, The difficulty with putting PostScript on low-resolution displays, we got our letter B here, and it looks beautiful because mathematics is perfect. But these squares here, these are our pixels. So we say, all right, let's shade any pixel which is completely inside the letter B. All right. There we go. No, this is clearly not going to work. All right, maybe let's shade anything which is more than 50% inside the letter B. Yeah, that still doesn't look... Okay, maybe, and then they start coming out, maybe we could do like anti-aliasing. Like if it's a little bit inside, we'll shade it kind of pale gray, and if it's a lot inside, we'll shade it dark gray, and this kind of looks a little blurry and everything. But what made TrueType fonts work so well on these low-resolution displays was they had something called hinting, which is where the designer could literally go into that letter B and say, no, when you draw it, I want you to fill in these pixels here. Those are the exact pixels. That's as good as this B is ever going to look on a 640 by 480 VGA display. Now, TrueType was fantastic. Apple launched on it straight away. Windows 3 did not include TrueType, but Windows 3.1 did. And if any of you is old enough to remember the days of Windows 3.1, you could actually go into your control panel fonts and you'd get these things pop up saying, enable TrueType fonts. And it was a big deal. This will be displayed on the screen and printed on your printer. You know, like I said, things that were revolutionary, now you're like, what? That was ever a big... It was. It was very common that you have something look great on screen, you got a printer, and your printer didn't know about those fonts. This solved that problem. And if you zoom right in, you can see the hinting. You can see where each of these fonts has been painstakingly mapped by hand down to individual pixels. Now, the next kind of big story in digital typography wasn't a computer or an operating system or a piece of hardware. It was a font. 1994, and there's a team at Microsoft working on something called Microsoft Bob. Anyone heard of Microsoft Bob? Because they had the team building Windows, so like it's got icons and everything, and there was another team going, maybe people don't want that. Maybe people want an operating system that's like your home. So if you want to look at your recipes, you click the kitchen, and if you want to see your appointments, there's a calendar hanging on the wall, and if you want to write a letter, you click on the writing desk here. And Bob came with a dog that would bounce around and help you get your work done, and the dog spoke in speech bubbles, because as we've seen, that's ubiquitous. And the speech bubbles were in Times New Roman. And there's a guy called Vincent Caner who was looking at this project and he went, why is the dog talking in a newspaper font? This is a bad idea. And so he created a sans serif font for Microsoft, MS, that was designed to look like a comic book, Comic Sans MS. Now, Comic Sans shipped with the Windows 95 Plus pack, and then it was shipped as part of Office 97. And it became the font that everybody loves to hate. Now, the thing about Comic Sans is that there is actually nothing wrong with it. Comic Sans is a perfectly good typeface. See, it's clear, it's readable, it's friendly. It is the people using it that is the problem. Because lots of people apparently go, ooh, I need to write a warning message about there's been a lot of dangerous attacks in this neighborhood. I'll use Comic Sans so as not to scare people. This is an actual invoice from a funeral home. Hello, we buried your husband, you owe us $3,000. Comic Sans! People just don't get it. I applied for a loan to buy a house years ago, and the accountant at my company actually wrote a letter to the bank in Comic Sans. And the bank kind of sent me, are you serious? I'm like, don't ask, just she likes it, it's fine. Now, Comic Sans, yeah, it's a perfectly good typeface, but it's childish and it's playful. And so whenever you are looking at fonts and you think maybe Comic Sans, think, stop, is this a childish, playful thing I'm doing? And if it is, awesome, go for it. Invitations to your kid's birthday party, invitations to your birthday party, that's fine. If you're sending invoices for a funeral home, please don't use Comic Sans. Now, the next big deal comes along a couple of years later, because there was a revolution in display technology. We went from big, chunky cathode ray tubes like old-style televisions to flat screens. And these technologies work in very, very different ways. Now, I'm going to take the Google here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in. I'm going to zoom right in, and I'm going to zoom in by taking a screenshot and going into Photoshop and zooming in. And if you zoom in far enough, you'll see that some of the letters that look black, they aren't actually black. Some of them are orange, some of them are blue. We got these kind of weird colored fringes. But now I'm going to take the same screenshot and I'm going to zoom in optically using a macro lens on an SLR camera. And when we do that, what we actually see, so what the Windows is sending to our screen is this thing. It's going yellow one, blue one, orange one, black one. What actually comes out the other side, the thing our eyes see, is this. Because your screen is made of a matrix of red, green, and blue liquid crystal elements. And what Microsoft had worked out is that you could exploit every pixel on your screen is actually 3 pixels side by side. There's a red one, a blue one, and a green one, which gives you 3 times the effective resolution. So if you go into something like your letter B and you put this color fringing on it, if we draw that on our old-style pixel display, it doesn't look great. But if we exploit the fact that we can address individual color channels, we effectively get triple the resolution. So side by side, the one on the left there, you see how we got kind of much more nuance around the edges? This is sub-pixel font rendering. Now, in 1998, Microsoft launched this at Comdex. There was a lot of, oh, this is so amazing. They even filed a patent on it. Problem is, Microsoft didn't invent this in 1998. Steve Wozniak invented this in about 1978. And Microsoft knew that because the Microsoft Basic Reference Manual from 1982 explicitly refers to using sub-pixel font rendering to get high resolution on an Apple display. Now, I have no idea whether Microsoft just forgot that they'd already discovered this thing and genuinely kind of rediscovered it, or if someone said, oh, don't tell them about the Apple thing or they may not grant our patent. But this is where we stand today. Microsoft still holds a patent on something that their own documentation says they didn't invent. But, you know, history is complicated. So one more thing I want to shout out while we are talking about, just on the subject of high-resolution displays on the Apple II, which is this. As created by a guy called Michael Koss in 1981, it's the smallest font I have ever seen. I think it's absolutely lovely. Every character in this typeface is drawn on a 5x3 display, which it meant he could get a full 80 columns by 25 rows of text on the Apple II, which was a pretty big deal at the time, so you could run Unix terminal emulators. But also, each one of these characters is less than 16 bits of memory, which is, nobody cares about that now, but that was a big deal. It's really quite cool. Now, the early 1980s, that was a big deal. By the time the 90s rolls around, no one cares about 16 bytes of RAM anymore because we've got CD-ROMs. And when you went to buy some software in the days before downloading, you'd get a CD-ROM and they'd probably throw another one in the box which would be full of things like fonts and clip art. And so you could be endlessly creative. It's those of you who are looking at like machine learning and stable diffusion and yeah, it's just that all over again. It's giving people tools and waiting for them to get the hang of using them. But then the internet comes along. The future is under construction. People are using dial-up modems to get onto their web pages. And the first kind of wave of web publishing, we had this massive challenge. Companies, this is about the time I started working as a professional developer. Companies were coming to us and going, I want a website that looks like my brochure. And they'd have this beautiful, glossy product catalog with these photographs and this wonderful type. And we'd be like, well, we can give you a choice of Arial or Comic Sans. And they'd be like, can't we have my font? And we'd say, no, you can't. And we'd have to explain, no, your font, even if you could license it to give out for free on the internet, which you probably can't, somebody visiting your website is going to have to sit there and wait while your font downloads, and then they're going to have to install it, and then they're going to have to restart their computer to look at it properly, and they are not going to do that. So we came up with a compromise, which was fallback font rendering. Using CSS, we could say, look, if by any chance this person has Futura Semi-Bold installed on their computer, please use that one. But if they don't, use Helvetica. And if they don't have Helvetica, you use Arial. And if they don't have Arial, let's just use anything that says it's sans serif is probably fine. This is the degree of precision that we had in the early days of the web. Put text on the page and make it probably a font, if you can. Now, there's not a lot of takeaways in this talk, but I am going to leave you with something fun that you can do to upset your colleagues. You need somebody you don't like very much, who is running Microsoft Windows, and you are going to need a copy of an open source package called FontForge. Now, what we're going to do is we are going to go across onto dafont.com, and we're going to find an interesting typeface that we really like, something like Abstract Groovy here. And what we're going to do is we are going to grab Abstract Groovy. This one says it's 100% free, so we're probably allowed to do this. We're going to download the font file. We're going to open it up in FontForge. The robot is moving. Is it supposed to do that? This isn't the start of the uprising? No, okay, cool, we're good. We're going to open up Abstract Groovy. Now, FontForge is an incredibly powerful program that allows you to create fonts, edit characters, tweak kerning, and change the names that are used in those typeface definitions. So we're going to go in here, we're going to open up Abstract Groovy, we're going to go to Font Info, I'm going to change the name, because there is a font called Helvetica Neue. And Helvetica Neue is the font that Apple launched when they launched Retina displays on iPads and iPhones. It's an incredibly cool font. Like, designers like to use it if they want to be really ultra hip. It's minimalist and it's lightweight. So we are going to export our Abstract Groovy, but we're just going to change those two fields so that it says it's Helvetica Neue. We're going to generate the file from that. And then we're going to send that over to our colleague and be like, hey, check this font out. It's really like 70s disco funky. And they're going to double click it and they're going to go, oh, that is funky. And they're going to hit the install button. And it's going to install Abstract Groovy. And they're probably not going to notice that the small print says Helvetica Neue. Now, they're not going to notice anything for a couple of weeks because Helvetica Neue is not a typeface that crops up in Windows very often. Then they're going to go to download WhatsApp, because WhatsApp's website uses Helvetica Neue because they want to be incredibly cool and hipsterish. And they go, oh, WhatsApp's got pretty funky. Then they're going to get an invoice from the iTunes store. They're like, oh, it's interesting. They're going to go and log into their banking software. Be like, wow, my accountant is seriously getting into this whole disco vibe. And they are going to have no idea what is going on. Now, I actually found this by mistake. A client I was working with sent me a Helvetica typeface to install for their project. It was horrible. Like, it was the worst version of Helvetica. I don't know where they found it. Like, imagine if you could buy Helvetica from like a backstreet night market in Shanghai or somewhere. It's like they'd got this. And I installed it, and I didn't notice anything. And then just like a bunch of websites looked weird, and I could not figure out why. And eventually I worked out that I had bad Helvetica somewhere in the font file. So you can completely mess with people, or maybe you just embrace it, you know? If you replace Helvetica Neue with Abstract Groovy, the whole internet just becomes really chilled out and friendly, and it's a much happier place. Now, web typography is a challenge. Web typography, web design is really difficult, because on the one hand, we have centuries of human experience about how to lay out information, how to make something readable, subtle, bold, how to capture people's attention, how to make sure things are navigable, everything from record labels to airport signage to designing books. There are schools of how to teach the history of type design. Like, you can buy a book. It's not about how to do design. It's about how to teach people about how people used to teach people about how to do design. That's how much history we're working with here. And every single bit of it is based on the idea that you start with a piece of paper or a brick wall or a poster or something, but it doesn't move. The client can't make things bigger and smaller. They can't make it wider and narrower. On the other hand, we have the web. We have scroll bars. We have liquid layouts. We have different device sizes. But we also have developers, and developers love building interfaces that are friendly and easy to use. You know, nobody in history has ever gone, oh, this looks amazing. I bet this person hired back-end developers to build it. So we had this challenge. How do we bridge this gap? Because people want the web, and the developers know how the web works, but they don't understand any of the centuries of stuff that's gone into it. Meanwhile, the industrial designers and the graphic designers and the typesetters, they're over there going, look, will you listen to us? First, we need to fix the page width. And you're like, we can't do that. And eventually, after about a decade of winding each other up in the pub after work, we sort of started getting some traction on this. Now, CSS is one of the big revolutions in web publishing. Lots of developers don't like it because lots of developers, one, their experience of CSS is they get given some CSS that wasn't written properly and told that now they have to manage it, which kind of sucks. But also, it was created to bridge a gap between these two worlds. So CSS is full of concepts that make sense. You recognize if you were a typesetter working in the 1950s, you'd be like, all right, line height, I get it. Leading, I get it. Gutters, I know what those things are. Developers, like, we don't even understand the problem that this was created to solve because we didn't go to that kind of school. One of the big advances in CSS and web typography came in 2009. A thing called WOF, the Web Open Font Format, which was finally a way of saying, look, this website belongs to our client and it should look like this. Here's the font we want. Put it in the browser, and when they get here, we want you to use this font to render it. Connections were fast enough that the extra download wasn't a problem, and licensing, we'd kind of figured out ways of making that work. But WOF also gave web designers a whole new box of tricks that they could play around with. Now, has any of you ever opened an email and found that it ends with a weird capital letter J just on its own? You ever experienced this? This is because Microsoft Windows, shipped with a font called Wingdings. And Wingdings, this is the days before Unicode, before emoji. Wingdings was a symbol font. It had, like if you said a capital letter A, you'd get the two-finger peace sign, and a 2 was a blank document, and W was a little diamond. So by mixing a normal font with Wingdings, you could get printers. They're called dingbats. That's where the name came from. A printer's dingbat is these kinds of signs. And Wingdings came out with this. Now, 1992, there's some consultant working in New York, and he's playing around with Microsoft Windows version something or other, and he discovers that if you type NYC in the Wingdings font, you get the skull and crossbones, the Star of David, and a thumbs up. And so he goes, oh, I've uncovered a secret conspiracy that Microsoft says it's okay to kill Jews in New York. And he phones the New York Post and says, I've got a secret Microsoft conspiracy. Now, the New York Post, being a sensible newspaper, say, no, go away. No, of course they didn't. They ran it as a front page story. Secret conspiracy. Now, of course, Microsoft turned around and went, what are you smoking? Like, where do you even get this from? It's a total coincidence. Of course we don't do that. Stop looking for hidden messages where they don't exist. But they must have remembered on some level, because about 5 years later, they created another font called Webdings. And if you type NYC in Webdings, you get I love New York, which I think is kind of cool. But Microsoft Outlook, if you put a smiley face at the end of your email, it would autocorrect it using Wingdings, and the smiley face in Wingdings was a capital letter J, which meant if your recipient was also using Microsoft Outlook on Windows, they'd get the smiley face. But if they were using any of the other email systems on the planet, like all of them, they would just get this weird J on its own. The reason I remember this is that in the early 2000s, I was using Microsoft Outlook at work, and my boss's name was J. And so I would just look at these two emails here, and tell me if you think maybe they send a slightly different message thanks to a font getting lost in translation there. So I'd get them, I'd be like, was that a smiley face? He'd be like, no. Bring donuts. I'm like, all right, you're actually angry. Cool. We've settled that. Now, the wonderful thing about web typography is that it means if we want to put things like icons and buttons and graphics on our web pages, we don't need to draw them. We can use a font to do that. There is a fantastic website out there called Font Awesome, which is this vast library of playback controls and arrows and icons and clip art and magnifying glasses, anything that you might need to build the user interface for your web app, available as a font. You go digging in there, you can even find R2-D2 has his own little font in there. Although for copyright reasons, he's called Astromech, because I guess someone didn't want to get sued by Lucasfilm. But what's amazing about these are vectors. These, like the PostScript and the Type 1 we looked at, this is a mathematically perfect geometric description of how to draw a little R2-D2. So the better your device gets, you do it right now, it's going to look really good on your Samsung phone and really good on your laptop screen. And that same code, a couple of years from now, will look really good on your Apple VR headset, or the heads-up display in your new car, or whatever technology we are going to invent, because we're rendering based on mathematics. We haven't had to make any of these abstractions and compromises because of the limits of the hardware. Now, the last revolution, certainly that I'd call a revolution, was e-ink displays. 2007, Amazon launched Kindle. And Kindle was a combination of, one, it was a wonderful piece of technology. The first time I saw a Kindle in a store, I was like, that's fake. Like, can I see a real one? And the person in the shop is like, that is a real one, look. And they turned the page. I was like, yes, I'll buy it. It's, by the way, how much? Actually, I don't care how much it is. I need this in my life now. I read voraciously, and if you told me 20 years ago, yeah, you're going to be doing all of your reading on a digital screen, no way. Because, I love computers, I work on computers, I had a smartphone. There's no way I'm going to read a novel on a computer. Turns out that's just because it's not nice to stare at a bright screen for that long. E-ink comes along. Now, e-ink is pretty amazing. The reason why e-ink is such a big deal, every pixel in your Kindle display has this black pigment and white pigment, and they have a little electrical charge on them. And when you turn the page, what it does is it zaps that pixel, and it just flips the polarity of that bit. But that's the only part that uses power. Once it's flipped, you can switch the power off and it stays like that, which is why devices like Kindle have a battery life that's measured in weeks, because they literally only use power when the display is being refreshed. So if you want to update something and then just leave it like that while you read the page and then flip it again, you get this incredibly good power consumption out of these devices. And the technology is getting better and better and better. 2 years ago, I swapped my Kindle for one of these. This is an Android tablet with an e-ink display. And it's kind of weird because it runs the Kindle app and I use it to do crossword puzzles and things, but I can also do my email on it. And it's like reading email on paper. It will play Doom. It doesn't look very good, but it does actually run it. So it's Android under the hood, but it's got a full e-ink display. And then last year, Onyx, the company who make it, they now do e-ink displays that are color. And we're not talking like Technicolor. We're talking like comic book, kind of slightly subdued color. But the future of book publishing is absolutely converging on high-definition, full-color digital devices, which is kind of sad because it means linotype machines aren't coming back anytime soon, and they're really quite neat. But it's also kind of exciting because these devices are getting better all the time. The displays in our phones are just, I mean, they're already at the point where my phone screen is better than my eyes. And I'm getting older, my eyes are going to get worse, the phones are going to get better. At some point, I just don't need to buy new phones anymore. Like, can I get a phone with a worse screen for less money? But that's not going to happen. They are going to continue getting better. We are delivering astonishing innovations in display technology. And what I love about this, about being a developer at this particular point in history, is we got these different stories converging. We've got the 5,000-year story of the evolution of written language and alphabets, and we're still on that journey. You know, every time somebody in your team uses a new emoji in Slack, and you're like, what does that mean? Ah, that means the release failed. You've just invented a new ideogram and communicated it within that culture, and who knows, maybe it'll spread around the world, or maybe it's just you and your team. But yeah, we are still inventing new alphabets and new ideograms every day. There is a story that goes back 500 years about industrial printing and typesetting and information design and books and layouts. And then we've got 50 years or so of how do we do this with a computer? How do we put it on screens? How do we do this when all we're actually working with is ones and zeros instead of hot metal and molten lead and steel? And we have I don't know what coming next, but I think it's going to be kind of cool. Now, I had a moment a couple of months ago. I was reading this book, The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson. And it was published in the 1990s, and it's a prophetic, far future science fiction story about nanoengineering and brain implants and all kinds of stuff that kind of looking at it going, that would be really cool if that ever happens. And I was rereading it. This is actually my paperback edition I have at home, but I also have this book on Kindle. And I was reading it at a railway station at night. And I'm just kind of flicking through the pages. And I get to this passage here. And it says, at times like this, the paper glowed softly and the letters stood out crisp and black like tree branches silhouetted against a full moon. And I just had this moment of, holy shit. Like, the thing in the book came true. And now I'm reading on a digital display. Because when this book was written, this technology did not exist. Nowhere close to it. This was science fiction. And now I'm like, okay, well, I guess it's just a documentary now. And that was a real kind of profound moment of all of this stuff that used to be far future science fiction is just coming true. We're just working the problem and kicking out solutions and being like, there you go. We did it. We got digital paper. Go and do fun stuff with it. And then somebody pointed me at this cartoon from 1934 about a television newspaper. Someday you may be able to receive the front page of your morning news printed and shown on the screen of a TV set. Can it be done? Well, yeah. I mean, they could probably do this in like 1940, so I don't get it. But, you know, I love looking at stuff which was science fiction when I was a kid and thinking, how much of this is coming true? What can we do with it? How can we incorporate these technologies and these devices, innovations, APIs, and use them to go out and build the next generation of really cool, awesome stuff? Thank you very much. Or rather, thank you very much in Helvetica Noi.
Wow, that was an insightful story.
So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Yes, we do.
We do, folks.
For some reason, I have a feeling that somebody has built, or if it hasn't happened, you will be the first one to build a printing press that uses Comic Sans.
So, you know, something I would love to do, like if I win the lottery and I got loads of money and I don't have to work anymore, I want to build an internet-connected linotype machine.
I do have one question.
So you go on and you type things into a web browser, and there's like a camera, and it does the whole thing with the lead, and then we print your linotype slug and we ship it to your house. I just think that would be an awesome thing that doesn't need to exist. Sorry, what was the question?
I do have one question on my own.
Yeah.
So how do you think we solve the issue with Unicode now that also, for instance, one day I was using a tractor emoji, and on my screen it was yellow, while on others it was green.
So actually, that's a good example. My favorite example of this, there's a Unicode emoji for a guitar, right? And it just says guitar. And so all the different companies interpreted guitar their own way. So, and I'm a guitar nerd, I love guitars. So Apple had it looks like a kind of red Fender Stratocaster electric guitar. And Android now Android I think is an Axis Eddie Van Halen signature. It's tiny, but you look closely, someone did the research. And Microsoft Windows version 10 just had a generic acoustic guitar, like the one your dad buys you because he thinks you're going to give up. And then clearly at Microsoft, they had a meeting and someone said, look, Apple and Android are cool because these are their guitars and we're Microsoft and we got this lame guitar. So in Windows 11, it's this beautiful big old ES335 jazz guitar. So yeah, and Unicode is interesting because the specification says, domestic cat facing left, for example, is the spec for one of them. And now we have black domestic cat, ginger domestic cat, but it doesn't specify anything else about it.
Exactly.
And famously, there's an emoji for pistol, but on iPhone devices, it's a water pistol because they didn't want to put a firearm on there in case people use it to send threatening emoji messages. And so it's this interesting, device manufacturers can implement the emoji spec however they like, so they can create their own visual style.
And sometimes app builders do it as well. So it's not only even devices.
And there's all kinds of weird. I have another talk which is all about text encoding and stuff, and talks about flags and things.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Do we have? Yeah.
Yes, down the front. Oh, hang on, we have a mic.
Right, thank you. It's very, very inspiring, interesting talk. I have my kind of small stint in publishing in late 90s. And back then, I'm Bulgarian, I used to have Cyrillic. And it wasn't mentioned in the talk, but the fonts then there were 8 bits, all of them 255. So you had to swap fonts. And I think the swappings and so on was created because of this part. Actually, have you ever needed to use any of the fonts before when there were only 8 bits? And you had to switch multiple fonts at the same time.
So I didn't work on anything multilingual in the days of 8-bit, but MS-DOS had the regular font, but it also had the box drawing character font. So a lot of the menus in the old DOS applications, you'd have to switch out the code page to be able to draw boxes and menus and graphics and stuff. So yeah, that's my only hands-on experience, is trying to write little games and things in DOS and having to switch code pages to get different fonts, to get different line drawing characters and things. So, but no, by the time I started doing anything with Cyrillic, Unicode was already a thing, for which I'm actually kind of grateful. It sounds like it was a headache in the days before that. So
yes, there are even certain screenshots of certain guys in Russian and so on. For example, I think Warcraft 2 was entirely was written with Cyrillic letters. Yes,
cool. Any other questions, folks?
There was one on the back front.
One down the back.
Just wanted to ask for your thoughts on with the new display technologies, the subpixel arrangement seems to be changing more and more. And what are your thoughts on how we're going to deal with this in the future? Or how does it stand for example, the 2x2 double green and et cetera, et cetera?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? You're talking about
what are your thoughts on different subpixel arrangements and
different pixel arrangements
types? Yes.
So the thing that actually makes subpixel font rendering, it's called ClearType. The thing that makes that happen is an abstraction layer built into the operating system, which can be replaced. So the onus there, if your device doesn't use a 3x1 pixel matrix, because I've seen some of them use like diamonds and hexagons and other kinds of arrangements, then the device manufacturer has to replace that part of the Windows display driver pipeline with something that's optimized for their display. So yeah, there are going to be things out there where it doesn't tend to work terribly well. To be honest, it's becoming irrelevant, because we're now at the point where you don't need the 3 subpixels anymore because we can make 1 pixel so small you can't see the edges. So something like retina displays, anything, once you get up to about 140, 450 dots per inch on a digital display, it doesn't matter. Now, the thing that's going to change that is going to be goggles, because goggles you view from a distance of 3, 4 inches. And so the pixels are a lot closer to your eye, and so that, I think, is... I'd like to say when augmented reality goes mainstream, but I've been saying that for 20 years and it hasn't happened yet. But I don't know, maybe today's the day. That's going to introduce a whole new set of challenges, particularly about building transparent display technology, which is the next, there is clearly a massive opportunity out there for something that looks like a pair of Ray-Bans that you just put on and you wear them out and about, and they have little subtle heads-up displays for maps and navigation. We're not there yet.
Will we soon have transparent fonts?
Yeah. Well, you already got transparent fonts. You look at O, it's got a hole in the middle. You can see straight through the hole.
Not fully
transparent. Big O, and you look through the middle. So.
Okay, but one more time. That was awesome.
Thank you.